The morning of the autumn hunt, Harwick Hall smelled of horses and ambition. Delia Farrow had been on her hands and knees since before first light, laying the fire in the blue parlor where Lady Ashmore would receive the ladies who came to watch the men ride out. The coal was damp. She had coaxed it for 20 minutes with bellows and steady breath, and when the flame finally caught and held, she sat back on her heels and allowed herself one slow exhale before rising to set the room in order. She was 23 years old. She had been at Harwick Hall for 11 months, taken on as an under-housemaid after her father's death, had left her with nothing but a small trunk of his books, a debt of £42 to a cousin who had no patience for waiting, and a letter of character from the vicar of her home village that spoke warmly of her diligence and her willingness to learn. To the other servants, she was simply the new girl. To Lady Ashmore, who had interviewed her without removing her eyes from a letter she was composing, she was a pair of useful hands and a quiet enough presence. She was not expected to be anything else. The hunt assembled on the east lawn at 8:30. Delia watched it from the upper corridor window as she carried linen to the guest rooms, the men in their red coats and dark coats moving among the horses with that particular ease of men who had never once wondered whether they belonged somewhere. The morning was cold and bright. Frost still lay along the lower edges of the garden walls, and the horse's breath rose in small clouds against the gray stone of the hall. She did not look for the Earl of Carston among them. She had never spoken to him. He had been at the hall for 3 days, one of 9 gentlemen invited for the autumn shooting, and in that time she had seen him only at a distance, once in the dining-room doorway, and once crossing the gravel drive in riding clothes. He was tall. He kept to himself. The upper housemaid, Mrs. Peel, had mentioned his name with a slight compression of the lips that conveyed disapproval, though she had not said of what. Delia was not curious about earls. She had other things to attend to. It was Mrs. Peel who sent her down to the yard with a message for the head groom about the carriage horse's near foreleg, which had been tender since Tuesday, and it was on her way back through the kitchen passage that she found him. He was standing at the table where the servants took their mid-morning bread, still in his greatcoat, his riding gloves set on the edge of the board beside him. His hat was in his hand. He was not sitting. He was simply standing in the way of a man who was very tired and had not yet decided what to do about it. And when Delia came through the door, he looked up, and the two of them regarded each other for a moment, in the plain morning light of the kitchen passage. He was not in the livery of an earl. That was what she thought first, because it was the most visible fact. He wore a dark green coat of good, but not exceptional cut, plain breeches, plain boots. No house badge, no distinguishing ribbon, no crest. He might have been a groom's assistant or a visiting tradesman's man, except for his hands, which were the hands of someone who had not done manual labor in some years, and his face, which was too still for a man uncertain of his welcome. She did not know him. She put the thought aside and did what she would do for any man who appeared to be standing in a cold passage in need of something. She said, "The bread is in the second box, sir, if you are looking for it. And there is a chair here, if you would like to sit." He looked at the chair. He looked at her. Something shifted very slightly in the lines around his eyes. "Thank you," he said. His voice was level, unhurried, and carried the faint weight of a man unaccustomed to being thanked for small things. He sat down. Delia fetched the bread and a cup of the morning's remaining coffee from the pot on the range, which was still warm enough to drink, and set both before him without ceremony, because she had 3 more rooms to see to before noon, and had no time for elaborate gestures. She was nearly out of the passage when he said, "You did not ask why I'm here." She paused at the door. She turned back and considered him for a moment, this quiet man in the plain coat with the bread and the cooling coffee. "I expect you had your reasons, sir," she said, and went back to her work. She would not know until 3 days later that the man she had given bread and a chair was Nathaniel Vane, the Earl of Carston, who had ridden out with the hunt that morning dressed as one of his own footmen, because he had wanted to know what his fellow guests were like when they thought no one of consequence was watching. He had not expected anyone to offer him bread. If you have stayed this close to the beginning of a story, you already sense what is coming. Stay a little longer. The hunt that day had gone badly, in the specific way that hunts go badly when a man has a great deal on his mind and not enough attention for his horse. Lord Carston had pulled up short at the second covert, let the other men ride on without him, and spent an hour alone at the edge of a field, watching the October sky move over the empty pasture before he had ridden back. He had changed before the luncheon, resumed his title and his coat of superfine blue wool, and taken his place at the table with the particular composure of a man who had long since learned to put the morning away. The luncheon was an elaborate affair. Lady Ashmore's table could accommodate 42, and today it accommodated 11, which meant that every empty place was visible, and every conversation carried across the room with ease. Lord Carston was placed at Lady Ashmore's right hand, which was his due. The rival he had not sought was placed at her left. Sir Gerald Bassett, a baronet of good estate and considerable self-regard, who had been pursuing the same parliamentary appointment that Lord Carston had declined to publicly seek, but had not declined to privately want. Sir Gerald had opinions about most things. He expressed them at length. Lord Carston ate his soup and said very little. It was not until the second remove that Sir Gerald said, loudly enough for the table to hear, "I understand there is some question of the Carston marshy land, whether it will be settled or not before the winter session." The table went quiet in the particular way of tables that have been waiting for someone to introduce a subject. Lord Carston set his fork down. "There is no question," he said. "The matter was settled last spring." "Ah," Sir Gerald smiled. "Then you will not be troubled by the petition that has been filed." The petition was the first Lord Carston had heard of it. He did not show this. He said, "I am never troubled by things that have no standing," and turned the conversation to the morning's weather. Later, in the long corridor outside the dining room, he stopped a footman he did not recognize, and asked whether there was a place in the house where he might sit quietly for an hour, with paper and a pen. The footman directed him to the small writing room at the end of the east wing, which was not used by the guests as a rule. It was Delia Farrow who came to light the fire there at 2:30, because the writing room had been overlooked in the morning's rounds, and she found him already at the desk. She stopped in the doorway with the coal scuttle in her hand. He looked up. She looked at him. Neither of them moved for the space of several seconds, and then she said, in exactly the same tone she had used that morning, "I beg your pardon, my lord. I did not know the room was in use." He had heard the rest of the form of address she had chosen, and knew that she knew. He said, "Come in, the fire would be welcome." She came in. She laid and lit the fire with the same economy of motion she had used that morning in the blue parlor, not hurrying, not performing composure, simply doing the work. When the fire caught, she rose and dusted her hands and turned to go. "Miss," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she would come to know over the following days as his particular mode of direct attention, a quality of stillness that was not cold but was entirely without performance, a man looking at something he wanted to understand. "This morning," he said, "you did not know who I was." "No, my lord." "You offered me bread and a chair." "You appeared to want both, my lord." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been in this house for 3 days. In that time, how many members of the household have offered me bread without being asked?" She considered this as a serious question, because it appeared to be one. I should think none, my lord. It is not the way things are generally done. No, he said, it is not. He looked down at the paper before him. Thank you for the fire. She left him there and carried the coal scuttle back down the corridor, and did not allow herself to think about his voice or the quality of his attention, or the way he had said, thank you, which was the same way he had said it that morning, as though the word cost him something and he gave it anyway. She was a housemaid. He was an earl. The distance between those two facts was not navigable, and she had been poor long enough to know the precise dimensions of walls she could not climb. She thought no more about it, which was to say she thought about it quite a lot, but kept those thoughts in the part of her mind she had built for things that were true, but useless, the part that housed her father's voice and the smell of the library at the house where she had grown up, and the particular quality of autumn light that had been present on the morning she had learned the extent of her father's debts. 3 days later, Lady Ashmore held a dinner for 24. The principal families of the county had been invited, and the occasion required the full staff in formal dress and every lamp and candle in the house brought to bear on the main rooms. Delia was assigned to the upper corridor, which meant carrying water and attending to the fires in the rooms where the female guests dressed, and keeping herself invisible through the 3 hours of the dinner itself. She was on the back stairs at 9 o'clock when she heard Lady Ashmore's voice from the corridor below, carrying upward with the directness of a woman who had never learned to lower it. "The girl in the east wing," Lady Ashmore said, to someone Delia could not see. "Delia Farrow. I want her transferred to the laundry after next week. She lacks the manner for the upper rooms." "She has given no trouble," said a second voice, which Delia recognized as Mrs. Peel's. "She speaks too directly," Lady Ashmore said. "The guests have noticed. It is an impertinence, however mild. A good housemaid does not speak unless spoken to, and does not arrange her face so that her opinions are legible." "Very good, my lady," said Mrs. Peel, in the tone that meant nothing good about it. Delia stood on the back stairs for a moment with the empty water pitcher in her hands, in the cold dark that smelled of old stone and tallow, and she pressed her lips together and waited until she was certain her face had arranged itself back into blankness, and then she went on down the stairs. The laundry was hard work in the winter. Her hands were already rough from the coal and the fires. She thought of the £42 she still owed her cousin, which at her current wage, and with the small deductions the housekeeper made for breakages and coal, and the mending of her uniform would take her 3 years to repay. 3 years in the laundry at Harwick Hall. There were worse fates. She had known women in worse situations. She was healthy, and had her father's stubbornness and the knowledge of how to keep quiet, and those were not negligible things. She went back to her work. On the final evening of the gentleman's visit, there was a small gathering in the drawing-room after supper. The guests and the family arranged around the fire and the card tables, while the servants moved at the edges of the room carrying trays. Delia had been asked to serve because one of the parlor maids had taken ill, and she had put on her best cap and her cleanest apron, and done it with her usual care. She was refilling the decanters at the sideboard when she heard Sir Gerald Bassett say to his companion, in a voice pitched just low enough to be intimate and just high enough to carry, "The little maid by the sideboard, do you see? Lady Ashmore's new acquisition. Quite wrong for the upper rooms, poor thing. No polish. She will end in the laundry before Christmas." His companion laughed, a short social sound without particular malice or particular interest. Delia poured the wine. She did not look up. The decanter was full, and she set it back on the board and picked up the next one, and she was entirely occupied with the mechanics of this when she became aware of a stillness in her peripheral sight, a particular quality of attention directed at her from across the room. Lord Carston was looking at her from his place beside the fire. She looked at him only for a moment. Not more than a second. and then she looked away and went on with the decanters. She did not know what was in his expression. She did not let herself look long enough to find out. She was there in the room, carrying the tray with the remaining glasses, when Lord Carstone rose from his chair and walked to the window overlooking the south lawn and stood there for a time with his back to the room. She watched him from the corner of her eye in the way that was entirely practical, because she needed to know where all the guests were to avoid collision. He stood at the window for 3 minutes. Then he came back and said something very quietly to Sir Gerald Bassett, who laughed once and then stopped laughing, and who after a moment said something in return that Delia did not hear, his voice dropping entirely. She went on with her work and did not think about it. She was on her way down the servants' stair with the empty tray when she heard footsteps behind her that were too deliberate to be any of the household staff. "Miss Farrow." She turned. Lord Carstone stood at the top of the stair, and the lamp in the passage threw a line of light along the edge of his face and the white of his cravat. She said, "My lord," and waited. He came down 2 steps, which placed them at a distance that was technically appropriate. And also, she was aware, considerably closer than they had stood at any previous point. The stair was narrow. He was tall. "I owe you an explanation," he said, "for the morning of the hunt." "You owe me nothing, my lord." "I was not being modest," he said. "I owe you one. I came into the kitchen passage dressed as one of my footmen because I wanted to see the house as it is seen by people who have no reason to perform for me. I have done it before, at my own houses. I came to Harwick because Lady Ashmore is a family connection, and I did not want to spend 3 days being managed by her entirely." He paused. "It is a habit that my housekeeper considers unreasonable. My steward finds it efficient. My mother, were she living, would have been mortified." Delia looked at him for a moment. She said, "And was it useful, my lord? The morning?" "Yes," he said. "In more than one respect." He looked at her with that quality of directness she had noticed before, the look that had no performance in it. "You will be assigned to the laundry next week." She did not ask how he knew. She said, "Yes, my lord." "Lady Ashmore considers you impertinent," he said. "I believe what she observed was competence without flattery, which she has learned to mistake for the same thing." She said nothing. The empty tray was in her hands, and she was very much aware of the cold of the stair and the warmth that was moving across her face without permission. "I will not tell you," he said, "that I can prevent it. I have no authority over Lady Ashmore's household. I am a guest." He paused. "I will tell you that I intend to write this week to my own housekeeper, Mrs. Clare, at Carston Park, regarding an open position as lady's maid to my aunt, who lives at the Dower Cottage and requires a competent and honest attendant." She felt the meaning of this land in her chest, like something dropped from a height. Softly, without breakage, she said, "My lord, I have no training as a lady's maid." "No," he said. "You have 11 months as an under-housemaid, a letter of character from a clergyman, and the ability to offer bread to a man who looks cold without requiring an explanation first. Mrs. Clare will teach you what she needs you to know." He looked at her steadily. "If you wish it." The lamp guttered once in some draught from below. The stair was very quiet. She said, "I wish it, my lord." He said, "Good." And then, after a pause that was not quite social in its quality, he said, "Miss Delia Farrow, see that you remember the name of Mrs. Clare." She said, "I will, my lord." He went back up the stairs. She stood on the landing with the tray in her hands and her heart beating in a manner entirely inconsistent with the stillness she was attempting to maintain, and she made herself count to 20 before she continued down. The letter to Mrs. Claire had been written and dispatched before Lord Carston left Harwick Hall. Delia did not know this at the time. What she knew was that the week passed, and she was assigned to the laundry as Lady Ashmore had decreed, and that she spent 2 mornings up to her elbows in linen and cold water before a message arrived via the Carston Park steward, a brief practical note that said there was a position available at the Dower Cottage attached to Carston Park in Derbyshire, if Miss Farrow chose to present herself before the 1st of November, and included the details of the carrier route from the nearest coaching inn. Mrs. Peel gave her the note without comment. Lady Ashmore, when informed that Delia intended to leave her service, said that she supposed it was to be expected, and said no more. Delia packed her trunk, returned the borrowed shawl she had worn against the cold of the laundry, and settled her remaining debt to her cousin from the small amount she had managed to save over 11 months. It left her with 4 shillings and the books and the letter of character. She thought this was enough. She had started with less. She had never been to Derbyshire. Carston Park was larger than Harwick Hall and quieter about it. The stone was lighter, the gardens more ordered, the whole place carrying a feeling of long occupation rather than recent ambition. The Dower Cottage, which in any other family's vocabulary would have been considered a substantial house, sat a 1/4 mile from the main building at the edge of the kitchen garden, and Lady Carston, the Earl's maternal aunt, was a small woman of 61 with arthritic hands and a precise way of speaking and an expression of permanent mild assessment. She interviewed Delia for 40 minutes. She asked about Delia's father, who had been a country solicitor with a love of Virgil and a weakness for lending money to cousins who did not repay it. She asked about the books Delia had brought in her trunk and whether she read. She asked about the laundry at Harwick Hall and whether Delia had found it unpleasant, and when Delia said it had been cold but the work was honest, Lady Carston made a small, approving sound. At the end of the interview she said, "My nephew wrote that you gave him bread when he was cold." Delia said, "He appeared to want it, my lady." Lady Carston said, "He has not been wanted for anything ordinary in some years. He will not say so." She rose stiffly from her chair. "You will do. Mrs. Clare will show you your room." Delia did not see Lord Carston for the first 3 weeks. He was in London for the parliamentary session. The Dower Cottage ran on its own quiet rhythm, and Lady Carston was a precise and not unkind employer, and Mrs. Clare taught Delia the management of her lady's wardrobe and her correspondence with a patience that Delia suspected had not been extended to all her predecessors. On the last day of October, Lady Carston said at breakfast, "My nephew will return from London tomorrow. He will dine here Thursday." Delia said, "Yes, my lady," and thought nothing particular about it, which was not entirely true. He came on Thursday. She did not see him arrive. She arranged the drawing room for the evening, set out the tea things, and positioned herself at the edge of the room in the correct manner of a lady's maid attending her employer's dinner, visible enough to be useful and still enough to be unnoticed. He came in with the cold still on his coat, said something to his aunt that made her make the same small approving sound she had made when Delia told her the laundry work was honest, and then looked up and found Delia standing against the wall. He said nothing. He gave her a small, undemonstrative nod of acknowledgement, the kind one gives to someone one recognizes and is glad to see without being in a position to express it, and then he gave his attention back to his aunt. The cold still on his coat. The small, undemonstrative nod. She put both of these things in the part of her mind where she kept things that were true, but not safe to examine too closely, and she went to fetch the tea. The dinner passed without event. Delia moved at the edges of it with her usual efficiency, and Lord Carston said very little, and Lady Carston said a great deal about the parliamentary petition that had been filed regarding the Carston marshland, which she considered an impertinence from a man Sir Gerald Bassett, who had no claim to the parcel and no understanding of drainage. Lord Carston said, "The petition has no standing." Lady Carston said, "Then see that it remains so." He said, "I will." Delia refilled the tea. She did not allow herself to notice the quality of his voice when he spoke to his aunt, which was different from how he spoke to anyone else. Not warmer, exactly, but less defended. After dinner, Lady Carston retired early, which she often did, and Lord Carston stayed in the drawing-room with the fire and a glass of port and a quarterly review he did not appear to be reading. And Delia remained, because she had not yet been dismissed. He said, without looking up from the page he was not reading, "Are you comfortable here?" She said, "Yes, my lord." "The work is suitable?" "Yes, my lord." He turned a page. "My aunt likes you," he said. "She does not say so, but she has begun to read aloud after her breakfast, which she only does when she has someone she considers worth reading aloud to." Delia did not know what to do with this. She said, "She has been very kind, my lord." He looked up then, and she felt the weight of his attention across the room, steady and direct in the way she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things, not a performance of interest, but the actual article. "Miss Farrow," he said, "you are not obliged to call me my lord at every sentence." She said, "It is the appropriate form of address, my lord." Something in his face shifted, not a smile, nothing so defined, but the expression of a man who had encountered something unexpected and found it, against his best intentions, a source of something almost like relief. "Yes," he said. "I know." He returned to the page he was not reading. She remained where she was. The fire crackled, and the clock on the mantel marked the quarter hour, and outside the window the November dark was complete and still. He said, after a long pause, "I lost my wife 4 years ago. November. She died 3 days after our son." Delia did not move. "I do not speak of it," he said, in the same level voice, as though he were reporting something from the quarterly review. "I find that I have said it now. I do not entirely know why." He closed the review. She was called Clara. The boy had no name. We had agreed to wait until he was born, and after he was not living, the name we had chosen seemed too large for what remained. The fire shifted. The clock ticked. She said very quietly, "I'm sorry, my lord." He said, "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I came to Harwick Hall this autumn because I had been in London for 6 months, and in London everything is a transaction. I wanted to see something that was not." He looked at the fire. "You gave me bread and a chair on a cold morning without asking what I had to offer in return. I have thought about it more than is rational." She felt her heart doing something in her chest that had nothing to do with her training or her station or her very thorough understanding of all the distances between where she stood and where he sat, and she pressed her hands together in front of her and kept her face level. She said, "It was only bread, my lord." He looked at her then, fully, the same quality of attention she had felt on the stair. Except now, they were in a warm room, and there was no tray between them, and no pretense that this was an ordinary exchange. "No," he said. "It was not." She could not answer that. She did not try. He rose, which meant the evening was ending. He said good night in the same quiet, level way he said everything, and she curtsied and he left. And she stood in the empty drawing-room for some time looking at the fire, her hands still folded before her. And she held the thought, she could not yet speak aloud, that the distance between the place she stood and the place he sat was real, and that neither of them had the right to simply step across it because they would both like to. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. The petition regarding the Carston marshland was brought before the local magistrate in December, and it was at that session that Sir Gerald Bassett, whose legal standing in the matter was in fact as thin as Lord Carston had maintained, attempted to introduce a new element, a letter purportedly from the late Lord Carston, the present Earl's father, which suggested that a verbal agreement had existed between the two families regarding the disputed parcel. The letter was read aloud in the court. Lord Carston sat with his solicitor and listened. Lady Carston had come to the session, which she was not obliged to do. She sat in the gallery in her good coat with Delia beside her, and when the letter was read, she made a sound that was not quite a word. Delia had heard that letter before. Not this letter, not these specific words. She had heard Lady Carston read aloud from the late Earl's correspondence, which she did on Tuesdays, because it was a habit she had maintained since his death. She knew the late Earl's phrasing and his particular way of constructing a sentence, and his consistent misspelling of the word necessary, which he always rendered with 2 C's and 1 S. The letter presented by Sir Gerald spelled the word correctly. In a clause where the late Earl was alleged to have discussed the necessity of maintaining family agreements, the word was spelled correctly. She leaned close to Lady Carston and said, very quietly, "My lady, the late lord misspelled necessary. Always. I have seen it in every letter of his you have read." Lady Carston looked at her for a moment. Then she looked down at the floor of the gallery, and then up again, with an expression of cold and focused clarity. She did not speak in the gallery. She waited. The session recessed after 2 hours, unresolved. In the corridor outside the court, Lady Carston requested a brief word with the magistrate, who was a man she had known for 30 years, and she conveyed to him, through Delia, who stood beside her and provided the specific details she requested, the nature of the spelling inconsistency. The magistrate listened. He said he would examine the original document more carefully. Lord Carston had come through the corridor in time to hear the last part of this exchange. He stood a few feet away, listening, without interrupting. When the magistrate had gone, he looked at Delia. She said, "I noticed it in the reading. I do not know if it is sufficient, my lord." He said quietly, "It is more than sufficient. The petition had no standing to begin with. The letter was the only weight in it." He paused. "How did you know his spelling?" "Lady Carston reads aloud on Tuesdays, my lord." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said to his aunt, "She is rather more than you implied when you wrote to tell me she would do." Lady Carston said, "I told you she was honest and competent. I did not think it necessary to enumerate." Delia looked at her hands. The petition was withdrawn before Christmas. The letter was examined by a second solicitor and found to present inconsistencies beyond the spelling. And Sir Gerald Bassett, faced with the implications of having introduced a document of doubtful origin into a legal proceeding, withdrew from the county for the winter. It was over quietly, without drama. That was the way Lord Carston had wanted it. He told his aunt this when they dined together in January, and Lady Carston said she had not expected anything else from him, and Delia served the tea and listened, and felt a kind of warmth in her chest that she was increasingly unable to attribute to the fire. In February, Lord Carston came to the Dower cottage on a Tuesday, which he did not usually do, and found Lady Carston in the sitting room with Delia beside her, both of them listening to a letter the late Earl had written in 1803 about the drainage of the North Field. He stopped in the doorway. Lady Carston looked at him with the expression of a woman who has been expecting something for some time and is gratified to see it arriving. She said, "Nathaniel, sit down." He sat. Delia moved to rise, but Lady Carston raised one arthritic hand in a small, definitive gesture, and she did not. They listened to the letter. The late Earl had opinions about drainage. Lord Carston sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them, listening. And when his aunt reached the end of the letter and set it down, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, he misspelled necessary in the 4th paragraph. Lady Carston said, he always did. He looked up. He looked at Delia, who was looking at the folded letter in Lady Carston's lap and attempting to appear occupied with something other than the conversation. He said, Miss Farrow. She looked at him. He said, my aunt has told me that she reads aloud on Tuesdays so that she has someone to read aloud to. He paused. I find that I would like to visit on Tuesdays as well. The fire, the clock, the old letter in Lady Carston's hands. She said, that would be very pleasant, my lord. Lady Carston made the small approving sound that was her version of satisfaction and returned to the correspondence. The Tuesdays came. They came regularly and with a quality of accumulated meaning that neither of them had named yet, but that had become, by March, as much a fixture of Delia's week as the laundry and the correspondence and the arranging of Lady Carston's gowns. He came in from Carston Park, which was close enough that he walked when the weather allowed. He brought his aunt the county news and sometimes a book he had acquired in the village, and occasionally, without comment, a jar of the particular preserved ginger she favored and could not easily obtain. He sat in the chair nearest the window when Lady Carston was present, and in the chair nearest the fire when she was resting. And they talked, he and Delia, about the books on the shelf, and the letters in the correspondence box, and the drainage of the north field, which had improved since his father's time, but was still imperfect. They did not talk about the things they were also talking about. She knew what his voice sounded like when he was genuinely interested in something. A slight deepening of attention. A pause before he spoke that was different from his ordinary pauses. She knew he took his coffee without sugar, and that he kept a folded handkerchief in the left breast pocket of his coat, and that he had a habit, when he was thinking, of drawing a slow breath through his nose and holding it for a second before releasing it. These were the kinds of things one noticed about a person one spent time with, she told herself. These were not unusual observations. On a Tuesday in late March, she came into the sitting room and found him there before her, standing at the bookshelf with his back to the door. And she stopped in the doorway the way he had stopped in the doorway in February, arrested by the particular quality of the moment, by the line of his shoulders and the afternoon light, and the book he was holding open with one finger at a page he appeared to be considering. He heard her and turned. She said, "Good afternoon, my lord." He said, "Good afternoon." He looked at her for a moment with the quiet directness that she had stopped trying to explain to herself. Then he said, "I have been thinking about something I would like to say to you and have not said." Her pulse was doing something unnecessary. She kept her hands still. He said, "I should have said it in November, when I was less uncertain. I should have said it in December, when you identified the spelling in the letter, and I understood that you had been attending to the things that mattered, without anyone asking you to. I should have said it in January, when I came to dinner, and realized that the room was different when you were in it." He paused. "I am saying it now because I do not think I will become less uncertain if I wait longer." She stood in the doorway of Lady Carston's sitting room on a Tuesday afternoon in late March, and she did not trust herself to speak. He said, "I am asking whether you would permit me to speak to Lady Carston." He meant to speak to Lady Carston as a formality, as the nearest thing she had to a family in this household, as a preceding step to a question that was not yet asked, but was present in the room between them, as completely as the fire and the afternoon light, and the book he was still holding. She said carefully, "I believe Lady Carston has been expecting you to ask." He looked at her then with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was the nearest thing to one she had seen on his face, a warmth in the eyes and a slight ease around the mouth, and it was over quickly, contained again in the familiar stillness. But she had seen it. She said, "My lord, I am a housemaid with 11 months at Harwick Hall and 4 months here." He said, "I know what you are." She said quietly, "You know very little about me." He said, "I know that you gave me bread and a chair on a cold morning, because I appeared to want them. I know that you read aloud to my aunt on Tuesdays. I know that you identified a spelling error in a forged letter that would have cost my estate a considerable sum if it had stood. I know that in 8 months I have not once observed you behave from anything other than your actual values." He paused. "There are people I have known for 20 years of whom I could not say the same." The afternoon light moved along the floorboards. The clock on the mantel marked the half-hour. She said, "My lord." He said, "Nathaniel." She could not say it. She was not there yet. She pressed her lips together and kept her face level and said, "You should speak to Lady Carston." He said, "Yes." He set the book down on the shelf, carefully, at the correct angle. "I will." Lady Carston was in the garden when he found her, in her coat and her good gloves, examining the progress of the early crocuses that grew along the south wall. She looked up when she heard him coming, and she assessed him with the expression she had used when she interviewed Delia in October, the expression of a woman who has spent 60 years developing an accurate instrument for the measurement of other people's intentions. He said, "I would like to speak to you about Miss Farrow." She said, "I know." He said, "I would like your blessing before I speak to her." Lady Carston was quiet for a moment, looking at the crocuses. Then she said, "Nathaniel, she is a good woman. She is not fashionable, and she is not wealthy, and she has no family of consequence, and she has been a housemaid, and none of those things are what matter." She turned and looked at him. "What matters is whether you will see her, whether you will keep seeing her when the novelty of being seen in return has worn away, whether in 10 years, when the world has resumed its ordinary pressure, you will still be the man who walks to the Dower cottage on Tuesdays." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then you have my blessing. See that you deserve it." The question was asked and answered in the sitting room 2 days later, when Lady Carston was absent, and the room held only the fire and the afternoon and the two of them. It was not a long conversation. He was not a man who required length to convey what he meant. He said what he had to say, and she said what she had to say. And there was a moment when they were both simply in the same room at the same distance, and his hand moved and found hers where it rested at her side, and he held it for a moment with a steadiness that was entirely him, and then he raised it and pressed it briefly to his mouth. She felt the warmth of his lips through the thin fabric of her glove. It was a contained thing, a deliberate thing, and it carried more weight than she had been prepared for. She said his name. Nathaniel. It was the first time. He closed his eyes for a moment. They stood together in Lady Carston's sitting room in the late afternoon of an April Thursday, and outside the window the kitchen garden was beginning to green, and the crocuses along the south wall were still standing. The announcement was made in May, at a small dinner held at Carston Park, to which Lady Carston and 2 of Lord Carston's closest friends were invited, and which was in every practical sense a gathering of the people whose opinion he had actually wanted. Sir Gerald Bassett was not among them. It was Lady Carston who told her in the carriage on the way to the dinner, what would be said that evening. Delia had understood that the dinner was a significant occasion, had dressed accordingly in the cream silk gown Lady Carston had given her from her own wardrobe, altered to fit, and had spent the journey in the controlled stillness of a person who is attempting not to feel too much in a small space. At the dinner, in the drawing room at Carston Park, before the assembled small company of people who had been chosen with care, Lord Carston stood and said simply that he intended to marry Miss Delia Farrow, that he was glad to say so among friends who would wish them well, and that he would be grateful if they would stay for the champagne he had been keeping for exactly this occasion. One of his friends, a gray-haired man named Colonel Whitmore, who had known the late Lord and appeared to have known Lord Carston since childhood, made a sound of unambiguous satisfaction. The second friend, Lady Whitmore, rose and came to Delia and took both her hands and said, "We have been hoping he would find someone worth finding. I am very glad he did." Delia looked across the room at him, where he stood with his champagne and his expression of contained warmth, looking at her with the quality of attention she had first noticed on the stair at Harwick Hall, and she understood, fully and at last, that he had been this person all along. She had been too careful to see it. The world had taught her to be careful, and she was not wrong to have learned that lesson, and it was also not the last word. She was married at Carston Park in June, in the small church at the edge of the estate where the late Lord and Lady were both buried, in a ceremony attended by Lady Carston and Colonel Whitmore and his wife and Mrs. Clare and 7 of the household who had asked to come. It was not a fashionable wedding. It was not meant to be. It was a marriage, which was a different and larger thing. The morning after, she sat in the window of her new rooms at Carston Park, which were larger than any room she had occupied in her life, and also, she found, entirely comfortable, and she held a letter she had carried in the pocket of her traveling trunk from October to June, a letter from her father written in the last winter of his life, which said that he was sorry he had left her so little, and that he hoped the world would show her, in time, that the things she carried inside herself were more than sufficient for whatever it demanded of her. She had read it many times. She sat in the window of her new rooms and read it again, slowly, in the morning light that came in off the kitchen garden wall. Nathaniel found her there an hour later. He said nothing at first, only came and sat in the chair beside the window, near enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and looked out at the garden. She folded her father's letter. He said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." Outside, the kitchen garden was in full early summer, the beans beginning to climb their poles, the rosemary in flower, the stone of the south wall warm in the sun. The crocuses were long gone. The roses were not yet open. The garden was in that useful, quiet stretch of itself that is not spectacular and is entirely sufficient, and it held them there in the window for a long and unhurried time. If this story found you this morning, take a moment before you go and know that there are others like it waiting whenever you need them. The small acts of dignity, the bread given freely, the chair offered without a question asked. These things have weight in the world, even when the world has not yet learned to see it. She set her father's letter on the windowsill, waited by the edge of the glass, and felt the morning settle around her like a garment she had finally grown into. The garden waited below. Nathaniel turned the pages of his quarterly review in the quiet beside her, and the summer was long, and they were in no particular hurry at all.